Early February 1943, Stalingrad, the gunfire has stopped. Snow falls onto a city that no longer resembles a city. Brick dust lies frozen where streets once ran. Steel beams jut from the ground like broken bones. The Volga flows silently beside the ruins, dark and slow, carrying no sign of the battle that has just ended. There are no marching armies now. No shouted orders. Only wind, moving through shattered walls that once held men alive only hours earlier. Abandoned rifles rest where hands let go. Tanks sit burned and half-buried, their turrets twisted toward nothing. Bodies remain where winter claimed them, German, Soviet, unnamed, preserved by cold, untouched by victory or defeat. This is what the battlefield looks like after everyone leaves. Not a place of triumph, not a place of celebration, but a vast, silent ledger of destruction written in rubble, steel, and frozen ground. To understand how this place came to look like this, the story must move backward, before the silence, before the snow covered everything, to the decisions, ambitions, and forces that brought the war here in the first place. The road to Stalingrad by the summer of 1942, the war in Europe had entered a new and far more dangerous phase. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, had survived the winter. Germany now faced a prolonged war of attrition on the Eastern Front, a type of conflict it was neither economically nor logistically prepared to fight indefinitely. Adolf Hitler believed the solution lay in the South. In April 1942, German planners finalized Operation Blue, a massive summer offensive aimed at the southern Soviet Union. Its objectives were clear and brutally practical. Seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, aircraft would remain grounded. Entire armies would stall. At the center of this plan stood a city that was never meant to become the focal point of the war: Stalingrad. Located on the western bank of the Volga River, Stalingrad was a major industrial hub. Its factories produced tractors that could be converted into tanks. Its rail lines connected northern and southern Soviet territories. Its docks carried oil, grain, and troops along one of the most important waterways in the Soviet Union, but its most dangerous feature was its name. The city bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself. Capturing it would be a symbolic blow, proof that Germany could strike at the heart of Soviet identity. Hitler became personally fixated on the city. In June 1942, German Army Group South advanced rapidly. Soviet defenses collapsed across wide stretches of open steppe. Entire Red Army units were encircled and destroyed. Luftwaffe aircraft dominated the skies, pounding retreating columns and rail junctions with near impunity. By late July, German forces were approaching the Volga. The Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, formed the spearhead of the assault toward Stalingrad. Alongside it advanced elements of the 4th Panzer Army, reinforcing the drive eastward. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most devastating air raids of the war. Stalingrad burned. Thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs fell onto residential districts, industrial plants, and river docks. Wooden houses ignited instantly. Firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods. Civilians fled toward the Volga under falling debris and strafing aircraft. An estimated 40,000 people were killed in the opening days alone. What remained of the city was no longer a functioning urban center, it was a field of ruins. German commanders believed the destruction would make capture easier. They were wrong. The bombed-out landscape eliminated the Wehrmacht's greatest advantages: mobility, coordination, and long-range firepower. Rubble turned streets into narrow corridors. Cellars and shattered walls became natural fortresses. Every building offered cover. Every pile of debris concealed defenders. The Red Army recognized this immediately. Stalin issued his most infamous order, Order No. 227, not one step back. Retreat was forbidden. Units were ordered to fight where they stood, no matter the cost. This was no longer a campaign of sweeping maneuvers. It became a fight measured in meters. In rooms, on stairwells, and factory halls choked with smoke and dust, Soviet General Vasily Chukov, commanding the 62nd Army, adopted a doctrine of extreme proximity. His soldiers pressed as close to German lines as possible, sometimes within grenade range, denying the Luftwaffe and artillery clear targets. This tactic became known as hugging the enemy. Day and night, the fighting continued. Positions changed hands repeatedly. A single apartment block could be captured, lost, and retaken multiple times in the same day. By October, German forces controlled most of the city, but not enough. The Volga still flowed. Soviet supply boats crossed under fire each night, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, and food. Wounded men were ferried back across the river, often under bombardment. Many never made it. Stalingrad did not fall. And as the city bled, the situation beyond its ruins began to shift quietly, methodically. The battlefield was forming, piece by piece, long before anyone would walk away from it. Encirclement and the freezing of the front. While the fighting inside Stalingrad consumed men and ammunition at an unprecedented rate, the larger war was moving in directions the German command failed to fully grasp. By November 1942, the Sixth Army was deeply embedded in the ruins of the city. Its flanks stretched thin across open steppe. These units were expected to hold hundreds of kilometers of exposed front in freezing conditions. Soviet planners had been watching closely. The defense of Stalingrad was never meant to be the end of the operation. It was meant to fix the German army and placehold it, bleed it. The plan was called Operation Uranus. On the morning of November 19, 1942, Soviet artillery opened fire north of Stalingrad. Communications collapsed. Within hours, Soviet tank and infantry formations punched through the weakened defenses. The following day, a second assault struck from the south. German commanders inside Stalingrad initially dismissed the attacks as local counteroffensives. Polis remained focused on capturing the last pockets of resistance within the city. By the time the scale of the Soviet maneuver became undeniable, it was already too late. On November 23, Soviet armored units from the north and south met near the town of Kalach. The encirclement was complete. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers were trapped inside Stalingrad. German, Romanian, and auxiliary units cut off from land supply routes. The vast battlefield that would one day lie silent had just become a sealed chamber. Hitler forbade retreat. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold its ground and promised that the Luftwaffe would supply it by air. Hermann Göring assured him this was possible. It was not. The required daily tonnage, over 600 tons, far exceeded the Luftwaffe's actual capacity, especially in winter conditions under constant Soviet attack. As December began, the situation inside the pocket deteriorated rapidly. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Ammunition dwindled. Fuel shortages immobilized vehicles and tanks, which were abandoned or destroyed to prevent capture. Wounded men lay untreated in cellars and ruined buildings. Temperatures fell to -30 degrees Celsius. Weapons froze, oil congealed. Frostbite claimed as many casualties as enemy fire. Horses, once a vital source of transport, were slaughtered for meat. Later, even that ran out. Outside the pocket, German relief efforts failed. Operation Winter Storm, launched in December 1942 by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, attempted to break through from the south. It came within roughly 50 kilometers of the encircled forces before being halted by Soviet counterattacks. The Sixth Army was ordered not to attempt a breakout on its own. Inside Stalingrad, hope thinned with each passing day. Soviet forces tightened the ring. Artillery systematically reduced German positions. Airfields were overrun. Supply drops increasingly fell into Soviet-held territory. Starving soldiers burned furniture, books, and even flooring for warmth. By January 1943, the battlefield had become static. There were no sweeping movements left, only isolated strongpoints surrounded by ice, rubble, and the dead. Entire regiments existed only on paper. Command structures fractured as officers were killed or incapacitated. Radios fell silent. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of the encirclement. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last German resistance in the north collapsed. The battle was over. What remained was not a city, not an army, but a frozen landscape shaped by months of violence, a battlefield. And it was only then, when the shooting stopped, that the true scale of what had been created began to emerge. When the fighting ended, the men who survived did not leave Stalingrad in triumph. They left in silence. Soviet soldiers moved cautiously through the ruins. Not because they expected resistance, but because the city itself had become dangerous. Collapsed walls shifted without warning. Unexploded shells lay buried beneath snow. Cellars were filled with carbon monoxide from months of fires burned for warmth. The human cost was everywhere. Bodies lay frozen in place, many unburied for weeks or months. Some still clutched weapons. Others were collapsed against walls or slumped in firing positions. Winter had preserved them, erasing the distinction between the recently dead and those killed early in the battle. German prisoners of war emerged from basements and factory halls in columns, thin, hollow-eyed, barely able to stand. Of the more than 90,000 taken captive, many would not survive the march east or the first months of imprisonment. Disease and starvation followed them long after they left the city. For Soviet troops, there was no time for reflection. Orders came quickly. Count the dead. Secure weapons. Clear routes. Prepare for possible counterattacks that would never come. Victory felt abstract here. There were no intact formations to salute. No clean lines of captured equipment. Only men stepping carefully through a graveyard that had no boundaries. Before the battle, Stalingrad had a population of over 400,000. By February 1943, only a fraction remained. Those who survived had lived underground for months, hiding in basements, sewers, and makeshift shelters. They scavenged for food among the ruins, melted snow for water, and burned whatever could be broken apart. When the fighting stopped, they emerged slowly. What they found was not a city waiting to be rebuilt, but a landscape stripped of function. Hospitals no longer existed. Schools were piles of brick. Factories were twisted skeletons of steel and concrete. Entire districts were unrecognizable, erased by bombardment and fire. Many civilians had no homes to return to. Some had lost entire families. Others could not identify where their streets had once been. The geography of memory no longer matched the ground. For them, the battlefield did not end when the soldiers left. It became the environment they were forced to live in. Stalingrad after the battle was not destroyed in the conventional sense. It was pulverized. Observers described the city as a continuous field of debris stretching for kilometers. Walls stood without roofs. Buildings collapsed inward, filling streets with rubble several meters deep. Rail lines were twisted. Craters overlapped until individual explosions could no longer be distinguished. Even the Volga's banks were scarred. Sunken barges and shattered docks clogged the shoreline. Ice carried fragments of wood, metal, and equipment downstream. This destruction had been gradual, layered over months. Each bombardment added to what came before. Each assault reduced what little structure remained. When soldiers finally walked away, the battlefield did not resemble a place where fighting had happened. It looked like the fighting had never stopped. And among the ruins scattered, half-buried, and silent lay the material evidence of modern war itself, waiting to be examined. After the last shots were fired, Stalingrad became one of the largest open-air graveyards of military technology in history. Destroyed tanks lay scattered across the city, and surrounding Stepanzer III and IV hulls burned black. Soviet T-34s half buried in snow, their tracks twisted or torn away. Many had been knocked out multiple times, repaired, and returned to service, only to be abandoned when fuel or crews ran out. Artillery pieces were left where they last fired. Some were intact but frozen solid, their breech mechanisms seized by ice. Others were shattered by counter-battery fire. Anti-tank guns pointed down empty streets, guarding nothing. Small arms littered the ground. Rifles, machine guns, pistols, and ammunition lay in heaps inside ruined buildings. Some had been deliberately smashed to prevent reuse. Others were simply dropped by exhausted men who could no longer carry them. Vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons were scattered along former supply routes, many stripped for parts or burned for warmth. Fuel dumps had been destroyed. Radios lay silent, their wires tangled among rubble. This was not the neat aftermath of a campaign. It was the residue of systems pushed far beyond their limits. For the German army, Stalingrad became a place they could not reclaim, not just physically, but psychologically. The battlefield they left behind told a story of collapse. Defensive positions were incomplete or improvised. Trenches ended abruptly where men had been killed or captured. Command posts were reduced to rubble, maps still pinned to walls that no longer stood. Documents were found everywhere: orders, diaries, field reports, abandoned in haste or resignation. Many revealed how completely the situation had deteriorated in the final weeks. Shortages, confusion, and the absence of any viable plan. German dead remained unburied in large numbers. There had been neither time nor manpower to recover them. Soviet burial teams would later inter them in mass graves, often without identification. For those who survived captivity, Stalingrad became synonymous with defeat in its purest form: not retreat, not regrouping, but total loss. Stalingrad was a decisive Soviet victory. It marked the first complete destruction of a German field army and shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. Yet standing in the ruins, there was little to celebrate. Soviet losses were staggering: well over 1 million killed, wounded, or captured over the course of the battle. Entire divisions had been consumed. Cities elsewhere in the Soviet Union still burned. The war was far from over. Commanders understood this. Official reports emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and necessity, not glory. The battlefield itself reinforced that message. It was too vast, too ruined, too human to allow triumphalism. Here, victory meant survival. And as attention shifted from what remained on the ground to how the battle had finally ended, the focus narrowed to the moment when the fighting stopped and the silence truly began. The last days inside the ruins. By late January 1943, Stalingrad was no longer a city in conflict. It was a collection of isolated pockets, each fighting its own final battle. The encircled German forces had been split into two main groups: the southern pocket, centered around the city center, and the northern pocket near the factories. Communication between them was sporadic or non-existent. Radios failed. Runners froze or were killed before reaching their destinations. On January 10th, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, the final offensive to destroy the encircled 6th Army. More than 7,000 Soviet guns and mortar opened fire in a massive, coordinated barrage. The bombardment lasted for hours, crushing already weakened positions. What little cover remained collapsed under the weight of explosives. German resistance continued, but it was no longer cohesive. Units fought independently, often unaware of the situation beyond the next ruined building. Ammunition was rationed to a handful of rounds per man. Artillery pieces fell silent when their last shells were fired. Inside cellars and bunkers, wounded soldiers lay stacked on makeshift stretchers. Medical supplies had run out weeks earlier. Surgeons operated without anesthesia. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Hunger hollowed faces beyond recognition. Orders still arrived from Berlin. Paulus was promoted to field marshal on January 30th, an unmistakable signal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear: Paulus did not kill himself. The following day, January 31st, Soviet forces overran his headquarters in the southern pocket. Paulus surrendered with what remained of his staff. Resistance in the southern part of the city ceased almost immediately. In the north, fighting continued. Factories that had been reduced to skeletal frameworks now became final strongholds. German units defended rubble piles and frozen trenches, knowing relief would never come. Soviet troops advanced methodically, clearing positions one by one. On February 2nd, the last organized resistance ended. The battle that had consumed Stalingrad for nearly 6 months was over. For the first time since the summer of 1942, there were no active front lines inside the city, no incoming fire. No counterattacks forming in the ruins. Only men standing still, uncertain of what to do next. As Soviet units secured the remaining areas, they began to move through territory that had not been walked without fear in months, and what they encountered would define how this battlefield would be remembered. When the silence took hold, the moment the fighting stopped did not arrive with clarity. There was no single hour when Stalingrad became quiet. The silence crept in gradually, spreading from one ruined block to the next. Soviet soldiers advanced cautiously, weapons raised, expecting resistance that never came. In many places they found only the dead. Entire sections of the city appeared frozen in time. Machine gun positions still faced empty streets. Ammunition belts lay draped over shattered concrete. Field kitchens stood abandoned, pots filled with ice. The last movements of the battle had been arrested by cold and exhaustion. In basements and tunnels, German wounded remained where they had been left. Some were alive, barely. Others had died only hours earlier. Soviet medics and guards moved through these spaces, separating the living from the dead, often without words. Above ground, the scale of destruction became visible for the first time without the distortion of combat. Smoke still rose from smoldering ruins, but the constant thunder of artillery was gone. Snow settled undisturbed on collapsed roofs. The wind carried ash and paper through empty streets. Soviet commanders ordered immediate assessments. Maps were drawn of what remained passable. Weapons were collected. Mines and booby traps were marked. Burial details were formed, though the sheer number of bodies made comprehensive recovery impossible in the short term. The battlefield extended beyond the city. On the surrounding steppe, wrecked vehicles and artillery pieces stretched for kilometers along former supply routes. Frozen corpses lay beside destroyed wagons and fuel trucks. In some areas, the ground was so churned by explosions that it resembled plowed earth. German airfields inside the pocket were scenes of complete collapse. Aircraft sat burned or abandoned where they had landed for the last time. Supply containers lay unopened, their contents never distributed. For Soviet soldiers, the first walk through the battlefield was sobering. Many had lost entire units here. Friends, commanders, replacements, gone. Victory did not erase those absences. It emphasized them. And for the first time, the battlefield existed not as a place of danger, but as a record, a physical document of what modern industrial war could do when it was allowed to run to its extreme. That record would shape decisions far beyond Stalingrad. But before it could influence the future, its immediate consequences had to be faced, counted, buried, and understood. Counting what was left behind when the fighting ended, the work that followed was grim, methodical, and overwhelming. The first task was accounting, an effort to understand the scale of what had just occurred. Soviet authorities began compiling casualty figures, material losses, and damage assessments. Even with careful documentation, the numbers could only approximate reality. The Battle of Stalingrad had consumed well over 2 million men in total. Soviet casualties killed, wounded, missing, or captured are estimated at more than 1 million. Axis losses reached approximately 750,000, including over 90,000 prisoners of war taken at surrender. But numbers failed to capture what lay on the ground. Burial teams moved through the city and surrounding areas for months. Bodies were recovered from collapsed buildings, trenches, shell craters, and riverbanks. Many could not be identified. Improvised mass graves became a necessity, marked only by location and date. In winter, the frozen ground made burial nearly impossible. Some bodies remained where they fell until spring thaw allowed excavation. Others were interred under rubble that would not be cleared for years. The physical damage to Stalingrad was nearly total. More than 90% of the city's buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. Industrial plants lay in ruins. Infrastructure, water, electricity, transportation had ceased to exist. Rail yards were unusable. Bridges were collapsed or mined. The port facilities along the Volga were wrecked. Environmental damage was equally severe. The soil was contaminated by fuel, chemicals, and unexploded ordnance. Fires had stripped vegetation. Debris clogged drainage systems and waterways. The battlefield itself resisted cleanup. Mines and unexploded shells continued to kill long after the battle ended. Clearing operations were slow and dangerous. Entire districts were declared off-limits until they could be made safe. For civilians, survival remained uncertain. Food shortages persisted. Shelter was scarce. Disease spread easily among those living in makeshift conditions. Yet even amid this devastation, the battlefield was already being absorbed into the war's larger machinery. Captured equipment was salvaged. Weapons were redistributed. Lessons were extracted from wreckage and reports. The ruins of Stalingrad became a training ground, a warning, and a resource. And as the city struggled to recover, the consequences of what had happened there began to ripple outward, reshaping strategies. confidence, and the direction of the war itself. The broader consequences of silence. The fall of Stalingrad did more than empty streets and frozen corpses. It altered the trajectory of the Eastern Front and the war as a whole. Strategically, the German army had suffered its first total defeat. The Sixth Army was gone. Relief attempts had failed. The myth of invincibility, carefully cultivated over 4 years of conquest, was shattered. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs revealed critical flaws in German command: rigidity, overconfidence, and underestimation of Soviet resilience. For the Red Army, the victory came at an immense cost, but it also provided a psychological boost. Troops who had endured urban hell and bitter winter emerged hardened and emboldened. Soviet command now had proof that large-scale offensives could succeed against the Wehrmacht. Morale improved, supply lines stabilized, and the momentum began shifting permanently in favor of the Allies. The battlefield itself became a silent teacher. Military analysts studied the ruins for months. They examined urban combat techniques, the destructive power of combined arms, and the limitations of supply under encirclement. Every building, street, and destroyed vehicle offered lessons about logistics, attrition, and the brutal arithmetic of modern war. Politically, Stalingrad resonated far beyond the front lines. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and propaganda emphasized the heroism of Soviet soldiers, the futility of German aggression, and the inevitability of Soviet victory. The image of frozen streets littered with wreckage became a symbol of sacrifice and endurance, an emblem of national survival. For civilians who remained or returned, the aftermath was immediate and personal. Families searched among ruins for missing loved ones. Children navigated debris to retrieve salvaged items. Entire communities had to rebuild not only homes but the social fabric torn apart by months of combat. The land itself bore scars. Craters, wrecked vehicles, and tangled steel became part of daily life, reminders of the battle that had swept through. Even the environment was transformed. Heavy artillery and constant bombardment had shifted riverbanks, cratered fields, and flattened entire neighborhoods. Vegetation would take decades to return. The battlefield silence was not a sign of recovery but of a frozen pause, a memory imprinted on stone, soil, and steel. By the spring of 1943, the true meaning of Stalingrad's silence was understood by all who walked the ruins. Victory was measured not only in territory gained or enemies captured, but in survival, endurance, and the heavy cost exacted on humanity and the landscape itself. The battlefield had become more than a military zone. It was a monument, not to glory, but to the profound consequences of total war. The silence that lasted when the last soldier left Stalingrad. The city and the battlefield around it stood in a quiet that was almost impossible to comprehend. It was a silence heavy with absence. No artillery thundered, no boots marched, no voices shouted orders. Only the wind moved, sweeping ash, snow, and dust over streets that had become graves. Walking through those ruins, one saw not victory or defeat alone, but the human cost etched into every surface. Burned-out tanks, collapsed buildings, frozen bodies all spoke of choices, strategies, and eras amplified by the scale of modern war. The battlefield was a ledger of destruction, impartial in its accounting, where survival and loss were recorded in stone and steel. The emptiness of Stalingrad reminds us that war is not only what happens in the moment of combat, but also what endures afterward. The aftermath, the silence, the ruin, the scattered remnants of lives and machines is the true witness to the scale of conflict. It is a space where history is written not by words but by traces left on the earth. Stalingrad also stands as a lesson in human endurance. Those who survived, soldiers and civilians alike, carried forward memories, scars, and knowledge that shaped the remainder of the war. The battlefield, abandoned yet imprinted with human effort, became both a warning and a testament. Even victory demands a price that is never fully repaid. And so when we look at the battlefield after everyone has gone, what we see is more than empty streets. We see the sum of ambition, suffering, and resilience. We see humanity at its most extreme, revealed not in the moment of action, but in the quiet that follows. Stalingrad teaches that the echoes of war persist long after the guns fall silent. and that those echoes shape the world that comes after.